Power is a dangerous drug, especially when it comes with a badge and a gun, but arrogance is the quiet poison that destroys the hand that wields it. Officer Owen Dempsey thought he was untouchable when he spotted a luxury sedan parked near the courthouse and decided to tow it out of pure racial spite. He wanted to teach the driver a lesson about who owned the streets. But Dempsey made one fatal mistake. The car belonged to the new district attorney, and the DA wasn't just going to get his car back. He was going to dismantle the officer's entire life. Oakage County was a town of two distinct realities, neatly divided by the murky waters of the Conover River. On the north side, manicured lawns and gated driveways hid old money and generational power. On the south side, cracking pavement and flickering streetlights watched over a community that had been over-policed and underprotected for decades. Robert Calloway grew up on the south side. Now at 42 years old, he sat in the corner office of the downtown courthouse as the newly elected district attorney. Calloway was a force of nature, tall, impeccably tailored, and possessing a mind like a steel trap. He had campaigned on a single, unwavering promise: accountability. He was the first black district attorney in Oakage history, and his election had sent a localized earthquake through the county's political establishment. But nowhere was the aftershock felt more violently than in the precinct houses of the Oakage Police Department. Officer Owen Dempsey was a relic of the old Oakage. A 15-year veteran of the force, Dempsey was a thick-necked, heavy-handed patrolman who viewed the streets as his personal thief. To Dempsey, the law was whatever he said it was at any given moment. He had amassed a staggering 24 citizen complaints over his career, ranging from excessive force to racial profiling, but the police union and a sympathetic old guard police chief had buried every single one. Dempsey hated Robert Calloway with a visceral, consuming passion. He hated the DA's reform policies. He hated the mandatory body camera audits Calloway had instituted. And if he were being brutally honest with himself in the dark of night, he hated the fact that a black man from the South Side now held the power to put cops in prison. It was a blistering Tuesday afternoon in mid-July. The heat radiating off the asphalt was thick enough to choke on. Calloway had just wrapped up a grueling 4-hour grand jury presentation regarding a corrupt city contractor. Exhausted but focused, he had parked his personal vehicle, a pristine midnight blue 2022 Audi A6, in the overflow municipal lot just a block from the courthouse. It was a space explicitly reserved for county officials, and Calloway's official laminated placard was displayed dead center on the dashboard. Dempsey was cruising his sector in car 42, the air conditioning blasting a lip full of chewing tobacco, turning his saliva brown. He was already in a foul mood. Earlier that week, Calloway's office had refused to prosecute a drug possession case Dempsey had brought in, citing an illegal, warrantless search. Dempsey felt humiliated. He felt emasculated. As he turned the corner onto Elm Street, the midnight blue Audi caught his eye. Dempsey slowed the cruiser to a crawl. He knew exactly whose car it was. The grapevine in the police department was faster than fiber optic cable, and every cop in the precinct knew the new DA drove a dark blue Audi. Dempsey pulled his cruiser up to the bumper and tapped the license plate into his mobile data terminal. The screen blinked back the registered owner, Robert A. Calloway. A slow, malicious grin spread across Dempsey's face. He looked at the parking space. The Audi was perfectly centered. The county official placard was clearly visible through the windshield, but the rear left tire was resting perhaps 2 inches over the faded white line that separated the county lot from a designated fire lane. A fire lane that hadn't been used or repainted since an adjacent building was demolished 6 years prior. To any rational officer, it was a non-issue. To Dempsey, it was a golden opportunity for petty, vindictive revenge. "Let's see how high and mighty you feel when you're riding the bus, counselor," Dempsey muttered to himself. He didn't call the city dispatch for a municipal tow. That would leave an official paper trail that a supervisor might flag. Instead, Dempsey reached for his personal cell phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. Higgins, towing Stan, speaking. A raspy voice answered. "Stan, it's Tommy," Dempsey said, his eyes locked on the DA's car. I got a live one for you down on Elm, right behind the courthouse annex, impeding a fire lane. Real public safety hazard. Stan Higgins chuckled, a wet, phlegmy sound. Right behind the courthouse? You sure about this, Tommy? That's heavy brass territory. Just hook it and book it, Stan. Dempsey sneered. And take it all the way out to the county line yard. Make sure this one gets the premium storage fee. You got it, boss. Be there in 10. Dempsey sat in his idling cruiser, watching like a predator as the rusted flatbed of Higgins' towing rattled down the street. He watched Stan jump out, hook the winch to the front axle of the beautiful, expensive sedan, and drag it violently up the steel ramp. The screech of the Audi's tires scraping against the metal was music to Dempsey's ears. He didn't write a ticket. He didn't leave a notice. He just watched the car disappear around the corner, spat his tobacco juice onto the pavement, and drove away, feeling like the king of Oakage County once again. He had no idea he had just lit the fuse on a bomb that would obliterate his world. At 6:15 p.m., Robert Calloway loosened his silk tie, grabbed his leather briefcase, and walked out of the heavy glass doors of the courthouse. The oppressive afternoon heat had given way to a muggy, stagnant evening. He was mentally reviewing his schedule for the next day, calculating the political capital he would need to spend to get Mayor Richard Hughes to sign off on an independent police oversight board. Calloway turned the corner into the municipal lot and stopped dead in his tracks. The spot where he had parked was empty, just a rectangle of oil-stained concrete staring back at him. For a brief, irrational second, Calloway thought he might have parked on a different street, but his memory was photographic. He looked down at his feet. There, etched into the soft, hot asphalt, were fresh, deep gouges, the unmistakable drag marks of a tow winch. Calloway didn't panic. He didn't scream or kick a trash can. He was a man who had built his career on cold, analytical composure. He pulled out his phone and dialed the police non-emergency line. Oakage Dispatch Operator 44, state your emergency or inquiry. This is District Attorney Robert Calloway. I'm calling to report a vehicle missing from the Elm Street municipal lot or to determine if it was impounded. License plate Delta Romeo 792. There was a long pause followed by the sound of furious typing. The dispatcher's voice returned suddenly tense. Mr. Calloway? Yes, sir. The vehicle was towed at 14:30 hours today. The authorizing officer was another pause. Officer Owen Dempsey, badge 714. The cited violation is impeding a designated emergency fire zone. Calloway's eyes narrowed. He looked at the faded yellow curb 10 yards away. He knew Dempsey's name. It was at the top of a very thick file sitting on his desk. Which impound lot operator? Higgins Towing, sir, out on Route 9. Thank you. Calloway hung up. He didn't call the chief of police to complain. He didn't demand a squad car come pick him up. He simply opened his Uber app and requested a ride. The drive out to Route 9 took 40 minutes. Higgins Towing was a sprawling dirt lot graveyard of wrecked metal and chain-link fences topped with razor wire situated on the industrial edge of the county. The smell of diesel fuel and rotting garbage hung heavy in the air. Calloway walked into the tiny, stiflingly hot portable office that served as the front desk. Behind a sheet of scratched, bulletproof glass sat Stan Higgins, a heavy-set man with grease-stained hands and a smug expression. "Help you," Stan grunted, not looking up from a dirty tabloid magazine. "I'm here to retrieve my vehicle." 2022 Audi A6, Calloway said, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. Stan punched some keys on an ancient computer. "Yeah, I got it. Impeding a fire lane. That'll be a $250 hook fee, $100 for the dolly, and a $75 overnight storage charge." "It hasn't been overnight," Calloway pointed out quietly. "It's been 4 hours past 5 p.m. counts as overnight, buddy." "Town ordinance," Stan said, grinning now. "Total is $425. Cash only." Calloway looked through the glass. In the back office, the door was cracked open. Sitting on a folding chair, drinking a can of cheap beer and laughing silently, was Officer Owen Dempsey. Dempsey locked eyes with Calloway, raised his beer in a mock toast, and let out a booming laugh. It was a blatant display of power, a message: I can take your property, I can inconvenience you, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Calloway didn't break eye contact with Dempsey. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his money clip, and counted out $425 in crisp bills. He slid them under the slot. I need an itemized stamped receipt, Calloway said to Stan, and I want a copy of the police authorization form. Whatever, Stan muttered, snatching the cash and printing out a crude receipt. Sign the release. Calloway walked out to the dirt lot. His beautiful car was covered in a thick layer of dust. He walked around it slowly. He noticed deep, fresh scratches on the front lower bumper where the winch chains had been improperly secured. He took out his phone and meticulously photographed the damage, the license plate, the surroundings, and the receipt. He climbed into the car and started the engine. As he drove out of the gates, he saw Dempsey standing by his cruiser. A smirk plastered across his face. Calloway didn't scowl. He didn't flip the officer off. As the air conditioning cooled his face, his mind was already shifting into a gear Dempsey couldn't possibly comprehend. Dempsey thought this was a street fight. He thought he had just won a turf war, but Robert Calloway didn't fight in the streets. He fought in courtrooms, and he was about to unleash a legal holocaust upon the Oakage Police Department. The next morning, the district attorney's office was functioning at a terrifyingly quiet frequency. Calloway arrived at 6 a.m. By 7 a.m., he had summoned his chief investigator, Lucy Jenkins, into his office. Jenkins was a former FBI forensic accountant who had left the bureau for a quieter life only to find herself deeply bored until Calloway hired her. She was brilliant, relentless, and possessed a deeply cynical view of local law enforcement. Calloway slid the Higgins towing receipt and the photographs of his car across his mahogany desk. Officer Owen Dempsey had my car illegally towed yesterday, Calloway said flatly. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. Are you kidding me? He towed the DA's car. The hubris is almost impressive. It's not hubris, Lucy. It's an illusion of invulnerability, Calloway replied, steepling his fingers. He did it to embarrass me. He did it because he thinks the badge makes him a king. But what caught my attention wasn't the tow itself. It was the operation at Higgins Towing. Cash only. Exorbitant immediate fees, and Dempsey was sitting in the back office drinking a beer while I paid it. Jenkins sat up straighter. The scent of blood was in the water. You think they're running a racket? I don't think it. I know it. Calloway said, a cop like Dempsey doesn't just spontaneously decide to use a specific tow company out of nowhere. There's a relationship there. I want you to pull every single parking violation, impound record, and tow authorization issued by Officer Owen Dempsey over the last 5 years. Cross-reference them with Higgins Towing. Then I want a full financial background check on Stan Higgins, his LLC, and anyone connected to his business, Robert Jenkins said, dropping the formalities. If we open this door, the police union is going to declare open warfare on this office. Captain Miller and the old guard will paralyze our prosecutions. They'll stop responding to subpoenas. They'll initiate a blue flu. Let them. Calloway, said his voice as hard as flint. I was elected to clean this city up. If we have to tear the precinct down to the foundation to do it, bring me a sledgehammer. For the next 3 weeks, a secret war room operated out of the windowless basement of the DA's building. Only Calloway Jenkins and 2 trusted paralegals had access. What they uncovered was a conspiracy so deeply entrenched and breathtakingly corrupt that it made Calloway sick to his stomach. Jenkins laid out the massive flowcharts on the basement walls. The data was damning. Over a 5-year period, Officer Dempsey had authorized over 1,200 vehicle tows. A staggering 92% of those tows were routed exclusively to Higgins Towing, entirely bypassing the city's rotational list of contracted bonded tow operators. But it was the demographics that turned the corruption into a civil rights atrocity. Look at the heat map, Robert Jenkins said, pointing a laser pointer at a massive map of Oakage County. The north side, the wealthy, predominantly white neighborhoods, was virtually blank, but the south side was covered in red dots. He's targeting minority neighborhoods. Calloway observed his jaw clenching. Low-income housing, apartment complexes, factory parking lots. Exactly, Jenkins said. He targets people who can't afford to fight back. Single mothers, shift workers, immigrants. He fabricates violations blocking sidewalks that don't exist, expired tags that aren't actually expired, and calls Stan Higgins. Higgins swoops in, teases the car, and demands a minimum of $400 cash to release it. And what happens if they can't pay? Calloway asked, knowing the answer, but needing to hear it. After 30 days, Higgins claims abandoned property files a mechanic's lien and auctions the cars off. Sometimes he just scraps them, Jenkins explained, pulling out a financial dossier. But here's the kill shot, Robert. I dug into the corporate structure of Higgins Towing, LLC. Stan Higgins isn't the sole owner. She slapped a printout from the Secretary of State's office onto the table. Higgins is the registered agent, the silent partner holding a 50% equity stake through a shell corporation called Blue Line Logistics is a woman named Brenda Higgins. Calloway stared at the name. His wife. Yes. Jenkins smiled grimly. Brenda Higgins, whose maiden name is Brenda Dempsey. She is Owen Dempsey's younger sister. The puzzle pieces locked together with a deafening click. It wasn't just petty harassment. It was a massive, highly organized racketeering enterprise. Dempsey used his badge to steal cars from poor people under the color of law. His brother-in-law held the cars hostage for cash, and the profits were funneled right back into Dempsey's pockets through his sister's shell company. Over 5 years, they had extorted nearly $1 million from the most vulnerable citizens of Oakage. Calloway felt a terrifying, righteous clarity wash over him. This isn't a badge misconduct complaint. This is Title 18, United States Code, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO, extortion under color of official right. Wire fraud, civil rights violations. If we take this to a grand jewelry locally, it'll leak, Jenkins warned. Captain Miller has moles in the clerk's office. We aren't going local, Calloway said softly. I'm calling the state attorney general and we're bringing in the civil rights division of the FBI. Oblivious to the sword dangling over his neck, Dempsey's arrogance only grew. Believing he had successfully intimidated the DA, he began to openly taunt Calloway's staff. A week after the tow Dempsey pulled over Evelyn Reed Calloway's chief of staff, a brilliant young lawyer who had been instrumental in drafting the police reform bills. It was raining. Dempsey walked up to her window, shining his heavy magite directly into her eyes. License and registration. Dempsey barked. Officer, what is the reason for this stop? Evelyn asked, shielding her eyes, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. Broken taillight? Dempsey lied smoothly. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. You work for Calloway, don't you? Yes, I do, she replied. Tell your boss to watch where he parks, Dempsey whispered. A nasty, threatening edge to his voice. Streets are dangerous. Bad things happen to nice cars. He didn't write her a ticket. He just walked away, leaving her sitting in the rain, trembling with anger. When Evelyn reported the incident to Calloway the next morning, he didn't react with anger. He just nodded slowly. Dempsey was digging his own grave with a backhoe. Calloway picked up his secure phone and dialed the private cell number of David Rosen, the lead federal prosecutor for the district. David, it's Robert. I have a package for you. It's a localized RICO conspiracy involving the Oakage Police Department. I have the paper trail, the financial links, and a clear pattern of civil rights violations. How big? Rosen asked on the other end. Big enough to end careers, Calloway promised. We need Title III wiretaps on 3 phones, and we need them yesterday. I want to hear every word Owen Dempsey and Stan Higgins say to each other. The federal machine woke up. For the next 2 months, Dempsey and Higgins were the stars of their very own FBI reality show, and they didn't even know it. Agents sat in vans half a mile from Higgins Towing, listening in real time as Dempsey casually called in. Fake tools laughed about targeting minorities and explicitly demanded his cut of the cash on recorded lines. The net was woven tight. There were no holes. On a crisp Monday morning in October, Robert Calloway stood in his office, looking out the window at the city skyline. At exactly 6 a.m., a fleet of black SUVs rolled into Oakage County. The hammer was about to drop. At precisely 6 a.m. on a crisp October morning, the illusion of Owen Dempsey's empire shattered. The operation was executed with the chilling, synchronized precision that only the federal government could orchestrate. There were no local sirens, no courtesy calls to the Oakage police chief, and absolutely no warning. A convoy of matte black Ford Explorers and armored tactical vehicles descended on 3 locations simultaneously. Higgins, towing on Route 9, the suburban home of Brenda and Stan Higgins, and a modest split-level house on the edge of the county where Officer Owen Dempsey slept. Dempsey was jolted awake by a sound he had delivered to countless others but never expected to hear himself, the deafening splintering of his own front door being battered off its hinges. FBI federal warrant. Show me your hands. Dempsey scrambled out of bed, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. He instinctively reached for his service weapon on the nightstand, but before his fingers could even brush the cold steel, the bedroom door was kicked open. 3 heavily armed FBI SWAT agents flooded the room. Assault rifles leveled directly at his chest. The blinding beam of a tactical light pinned him against the wall. Don't even breathe toward that gun. The lead agent barked his voice. Eyes, devoid of any professional courtesy. Hands on your head. Turn around now. Dempsey, clad only in his boxer shorts, raised his hands. Confusion weared with his deeply ingrained arrogance. Hold on, he stammered, his voice cracking. I'm Oakage PD. I'm on the job. You guys are making a massive mistake. We know exactly who you are. Officer Dempsey. Special Agent in charge, Gregory Hayes said as he stepped into the room holding a thick sheath of papers. Owen Dempsey, you are under arrest for violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, conspiracy to commit wire fraud extortion under color of official right and deprivation of civil rights under the color of law. The words hit Dempsey like a physical blow. RICO federal charges. The color drained from his face as the agent slammed him roughly against his own dresser and ratcheted the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. The terrifying reality of his situation began to set in. He wasn't dealing with internal affairs. He wasn't dealing with a slap on the wrist from a friendly police chief. He was in the grip of the Department of Justice. Simultaneously, out on Route 9, Higgins Towing was being dismantled. Dozens of federal agents swarmed the dirt lot. They seized computers, filing cabinets, and the contents of a hidden floor safe that contained over $80,000 in undocumented cash. Stan Higgins didn't even make it to the handcuffs before he broke. Standing in his pajamas in his own driveway, watching agents tear apart his wife's home office, Stan immediately asked for a deal. The brotherhood he and Dempsey shared evaporated the second Stan faced a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. By 8 a.m., the news had hit the Oakage Police Department like a tactical nuke. Chief William Miller, a red-faced, barrel-chested man who had protected Dempsey for years, stormed into the district attorney's office, bypassing the reception desk entirely. He threw open the doors to Robert Calloway's suite, his eyes bulging with rage. "What the hell is going on, Robert?" Miller roared, slamming his palms onto the DA's mahogany desk. "The feds just walked one of my senior officers out of his house in his underwear. They bypassed my entire chain of command." "You set this up." Calloway didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He calmly finished signing a motion, capped his fountain pen, and looked up at the chief. "Take a seat, William. Or don't. But lower your voice," Calloway said, his tone icy. "You brought the FBI into my precinct over a parking dispute." Miller spat, though his bravado was faltering under Calloway's dead-eyed stare. "You're destroying a man's life because he towed your precious Audi. I brought the FBI into your precinct, Chief, because you allowed a criminal enterprise to operate out of your locker room," Calloway replied, standing up. He picked up a thick, bound dossier from his desk and tossed it violently. It landed at Miller's feet with a heavy thud. "That is a 5-year forensic accounting of Officer Dempsey's towing history. Over 1,000 vehicles, $1 million extorted from the poorest, most vulnerable citizens of Oakage, funneled directly into a shell company owned by Dempsey's sister. He didn't just tow my car, William. He's been terrorizing the South Side under your protection, and I have it all on Title III wiretaps. Miller stared at the dossier, the color washing out of his face. The fight completely left his body. Wiretaps, financial records, RICO. The old guard playbook of sweeping things under the rug was entirely useless against a federal grand jury indictment. The police union, Miller started weakly. Will not touch him, Calloway interrupted. I spoke to the union president an hour ago. Once I read him the summary of the extortion charges and mentioned the FBI Civil Rights Division, he explicitly stated they will not be funding Dempsey's legal defense. He is entirely alone. Calloway leaned over the desk, his eyes burning with years of built-up frustration against a broken system. I told you I was going to clean up this city, William. Dempsey was the infection. Consider this the amputation. Now get out of my office and go try to salvage whatever is left of your department's reputation. Down in the federal holding cells, Owen Dempsey sat shivering on a stainless steel bench. For the first time in 15 years, he was entirely stripped of his power. He had used his badge as a weapon, and now it was gone. The only thing waiting for him was a judge, a jewelry, and the terrifying realization that he was about to face the very justice system he had spent his career manipulating. The criminal trial of the United States versus Owen Dempsey was not a battle. It was a clinical, methodical slaughter. From the moment the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung open, it was clear that Dempsey's reign of terror had reached its terminal conclusion. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. Reporters filled the back benches, and citizens from the South Side, people who had spent years being victimized in silence, lined the gallery. Federal prosecutor David Rosen moved through his case in chief with the terrifying precision of a surgeon. He didn't rely on grand theatrics. He relied on an avalanche of undeniable data. For 3 days, Rosen paraded the victims of Dempsey's extortion ring in front of the jury. Single mothers who had lost their jobs because they couldn't get to work. Elderly men who had their only mode of transportation auctioned off for pennies. Young college students who had their savings wiped out to pay Higgins towing. But the fatal blow to Dempsey's defense wasn't the victims' tearful testimonies, nor was it Lucy Jenkins's masterful breakdown of the forensic accounting. The fatal blow was Stan Higgins. Desperate to avoid dying in a federal penitentiary, Stan had taken an aggressive plea deal and turned state's evidence. When Stan's name was called to the witness stand, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. He wore a rumpled, ill-fitting suit, a stark contrast to his usual grease-stained coveralls. As he raised his right hand to swear the oath, he steadfastly refused to look at the defense table. Stan didn't just throw his brother-in-law under the bus, he reversed over him. Guided by Rosen's sharp questioning, Stan detailed the entire operation from its inception. He explained the encrypted radio codes Dempsey used to signal a lucrative target. He described the cash drops that took place in brown paper bags during Sunday family barbecues, the money handed over while children played in the yard. Then came the centerpiece of Stan's testimony, the ledger. Stan handed the prosecution the meticulously kept handwritten accounting book his wife Brenda had hidden beneath the floorboards of their home. Every illegal tow, every fabricated violation, and every split of the cash was documented. It was a roadmap of pure, unadulterated corruption. Yet Rosen saved his most devastating weapon for the final afternoon of the prosecution's case. He submitted a flash drive into evidence, the Title III FBI wiretaps. The courtroom speakers crackled to life. It was a recording from late August, mere weeks before the federal raid. The pristine acoustics of the federal courthouse amplified Owen Dempsey's recorded voice, dripping with contempt, entitlement, and sheer arrogance. I got another live one for you, Stan. Dempsey's voice echoed, accompanied by the faint sound of his cruiser's turn signal clicking in the background. Down at the Cypress housing projects. Nice little silver Honda Civic. The tags are good and she's parked legal, but I'm writing it up as a public nuisance blocking a fire hydrant. Let the single mom ride the bus for a few weeks and think about her life choices. Make sure you hit her with the maximum overnight storage fee, brother. Daddy needs that new cedar deck for the backyard before Labor Day. A collective audible gasp swept through the gallery. Several jurors physically recoiled in their seats, their faces twisting in absolute disgust. In the front row, Robert Calloway sat perfectly motionless. His face was an unreadable mask of stone, his eyes fixed on the defense table. At that table, Owen Dempsey physically shattered. The arrogant, thick-necked cop who had terrorized the streets was gone. He shrank into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands, trying to hide from the burning stares of the jewelry and the public. He couldn't hide behind the thin blue line anymore. The entire world had just heard him for what he truly was, a predator, masquerading as a protector. The next morning, before the defense attorney could even attempt to present a hollow opening statement for their side, Dempsey surrendered. Approaching the bench with his head bowed, his lawyer announced that Dempsey was changing his plea to guilty on all federal counts. The criminal fight was over, but Robert Calloway's war was fought on two fronts. While the federal government secured Dempsey's impending imprisonment, Calloway had quietly set the stage to obliterate the corrupt financial and political infrastructure that had allowed the officer to thrive. As a sitting district attorney, Calloway was legally barred from filing civil lawsuits against the city. But his former law school roommate and notoriously ruthless civil rights attorney, Harrison Pierce, operated under no such restrictions. The moment Dempsey's guilty plea was entered into the federal record, Calloway arranged for Pierce to receive the entire unsealed federal evidence file. Armed with a mountain of absolute judicially validated proof, Pierce filed a monstrous multi-million-dollar class action civil rights lawsuit against the city of Oakage, the Oakage Police Department, and Owen Dempsey. Personally, the lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal destruction. It alleged a systemic, decades-long failure to supervise, train, and discipline officers, explicitly pointing to Dempsey's 24 buried citizen complaints as undeniable proof that the city's leadership was entirely complicit in the extortion ring. The city council and Mayor Richard Hughes panicked. The evidence was completely indefensible. Taking a class action suit of this magnitude to a civil jury in the current political climate would result in a verdict that could literally bankrupt the municipality. Within weeks, the city capitulated, agreeing to a staggering $6 million settlement. This money was placed in a restitution fund for the hundreds of victims Dempsey had preyed upon over the years. But Calloway hadn't engineered the lawsuit just for the money. Buried within the binding settlement agreement was a non-negotiable stipulation. Mayor Hughes was legally mandated to immediately create and fully fund the Independent Civilian Police Oversight Board, the exact institution the political establishment had spent years blocking. Seeing the undeniable writing on the wall and terrified that he might be named in a secondary federal probe regarding the buried complaints, Police Chief William Miller didn't wait to be fired. He quietly cleared out his office under the cover of darkness and submitted his early retirement papers, fleeing the city in disgrace. And then came the bureaucratic execution that finally broke Dempsey's spirit entirely. Because Dempsey had pled guilty to severe federal felonies committed while explicitly acting under the color of official law, a state tribunal was convened to invoke a rarely used punitive municipal statute. In a hearing that lasted less than 20 minutes, Owen Dempsey was permanently stripped of his law enforcement pension. Every single dime he had paid into the retirement system over his 15-year career was seized and liquidated to help fund the restitution payments to his victims. He was left with absolutely nothing. No savings, no future, no safety net. On the day of his formal sentencing, Dempsey stood before Federal District Judge Eleanor Vance. He wore a bright orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a heavy chain around his waist. He looked 20 years older, the hollow, terrified stare of a ruined man replacing the smug smirk he had worn just months prior. "Mr. Dempsey, Judge Vance," began her voice. echoing coldly in the cavernous room, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. Law enforcement officers are granted extraordinary, almost unfathomable power by the public trust. You weaponized that sacred trust. You did not protect and serve your community. You hunted and extorted them. You specifically targeted those who you believed had no voice, no financial power, and no legal recourse. And you did it out of sheer, unadulterated greed and vindictive spite. She adjusted her glasses, staring down at him from the elevated bench with absolute contempt. You believed your badge made you immune to the consequences of your actions. You believed you were above the law. Let today serve as a permanent reminder to anyone who wears a uniform that the law is a very heavy object to have fall upon you. I sentence you to 144 months in federal prison to be served consecutively with no possibility of early release or parole. 12 years. As the heavy-set U.S. Marshals grabbed Dempsey by the arms to lead him toward the holding cells, he stopped. He looked back over his shoulder into the packed gallery. He bypassed the reporters and the victims, locking eyes with Robert Calloway one final time. Calloway didn't gloat. He didn't offer a triumphant smile. He simply offered a slow, deliberate nod, a silent, chilling acknowledgement of a promise kept. The district attorney picked up his leather briefcase, turned his back on the disgraced, ruined cop, and walked out of the courtroom, ready to get back to the work of rebuilding his city. The heavy, reinforced steel door of cell 412 slammed shut with a deafening metallic finality that echoed through the bleak corridors of the Federal Correctional Institution. It was a sound Owen Dempsey would have to get used to. He was no longer Officer Dempsey. He was inmate 88492-054. Because of his status as a former law enforcement officer, putting Dempsey in the general population was equivalent to a death sentence. The federal prison system was overflowing with men who harbored a deep, violent hatred for the badge. Consequently, Dempsey was placed in the Special Housing Unit, a segregated wing designed for high-profile inmates, informants, and disgraced cops. It was for all intents and purposes solitary confinement. For 23 hours a day, Dempsey sat in a concrete box measuring 6 feet by 9 feet. There was a thin mattress on a steel slab, a stainless steel toilet, and a narrow slit of frosted glass that let in a dull, mocking sliver of daylight. The man who had once roamed the streets of Oakage in a climate-controlled cruiser, barking orders and watching citizens tremble, was now entirely powerless. He dictated nothing. He controlled nothing. He was told when to wake, when to eat the tasteless, tepid food shoved through a slot in his door, and when to take his single hour of recreation in a chain-link cage under the watchful eyes of armed guards. In the suffocating silence of his cell, the arrogance that had defined his life slowly rotted into a desperate, gnawing paranoia. Dempsey had endless hours to replay the events in his mind. The midnight blue Audi, the smug call to Stan Higgins, the petty joy of watching the DA's car dragged away. He had traded a comfortable life, a guaranteed pension, and his freedom for a momentary thrill of spite. While Dempsey withered in the dark, the city of Oakage was undergoing a painful, spectacular rebirth. Robert Calloway did not rest on the laurels of his victory. Taking down Dempsey and the Higgins towing extortion ring was only the amputation of the most infected limb. Calloway was determined to cure the whole body. The $6 million class action settlement had bankrupted the political capital of the old guard. Mayor Richard Hughes, terrified of further federal scrutiny, gave Calloway virtually everything he demanded. The Oakage Civilian Police Oversight Board was officially ratified in January. It wasn't a toothless committee of political appointees. Calloway ensured the board had subpoena power, independent investigators, and the authority to recommend the immediate termination of officers who violated civil rights. But the remnants of the old Oakage Police Department didn't surrender quietly. Captain Richard Braddock, a 20-year veteran and a close friend of the disgraced Chief Miller, attempted to organize a subtle rebellion. Braddock encouraged his patrolmen to engage in a work slowdown, a deliberate stalling of response times to the south side, hoping the spike in petty crime would force the city to dismantle the oversight board. Calloway saw the mutiny forming before it even fully materialized. He called his chief investigator, Lucy Jenkins. "Braddock is playing games," Calloway said, staring at the weekly dispatch metrics that showed response times in minority neighborhoods had inexplicably doubled. "He thinks he can hold the city hostage. He's using the union to shield himself," Jenkins replied, tapping a pen against her notebook. "The patrolmen won't talk. They're terrified of retaliation. We don't need them to talk. We have the data," Calloway said, his voice cold and resolute. "Audit the GPS trackers on every cruiser in Braddock's sector. Cross-reference their idle times with the incoming 911 logs. If they are sitting in parking lots while emergency calls are holding, we don't just fire them. We indict them for official misconduct and reckless endangerment." The audit was brutal and incredibly swift. Jenkins uncovered that Braddock had explicitly ordered units to stand down on nonviolent calls in the South Side. Armed with the digital proof, Calloway didn't bother with a closed-door meeting. He bypassed the department entirely and took the evidence directly to the newly formed Oversight Board's first public hearing. In a packed city council chamber with local news cameras rolling, Calloway laid out the GPS data. He publicly accused Captain Braddock of weaponizing public safety for political leverage. Under the glaring lights of public scrutiny and facing the terrifying prospect of joining Dempsey in federal prison, Braddock's resolve crumbled. He resigned in disgrace the very next morning, taking 3 of his most toxic loyalist sergeants with him. The purge sent a shockwave through the precinct. The message was unmistakable. The era of the untouchable badge was dead and buried. To replace the outgoing rot, Mayor Hughes, heavily influenced by Calloway, brought in an outside reformer as the new chief of police, Chief David Caldwell, a man known for transparency and community-based policing. Caldwell immediately implemented mandatory de-escalation training, strict auditing of all impounds, and a zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling. On the South Side, the atmosphere slowly began to change. The $6 million in settlement funds began flowing into the community. Families who had been financially crippled by Dempsey's extortion ring received heavy restitution checks. Single mothers got their savings back. Men who had lost their jobs because they couldn't afford to rescue their cars from Higgins Towing found themselves with the capital to start over. For the first time in generations, the residents of the South Side looked at the district attorney's office not as an instrument of oppression, but as a shield. And what of the Higgins family? The criminal conspiracy had fractured them beyond repair. Stan Higgins served his time in a minimum security facility in Pennsylvania. His marriage to Dempsey's sister completely destroyed. Brenda Higgins, the architect of the shell company, avoided prison by cooperating fully and turning over every hidden asset, but she was left utterly destitute. The federal government seized her home, her bank accounts, and her vehicles. She was forced to move into a tiny, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the county, working night shifts at a fulfillment center just to survive forever. Marked as a convicted felon, the empire of petty tyranny had been burned to the ground. But the final chapter of Owen Dempsey's story had yet to be written. 5 years later, the sweltering heat of July had once again descended upon Oakage County. The city was fundamentally different now. Crime rates had stabilized. Police-community relations were experiencing unprecedented levels of trust. And Robert Calloway had just won his re-election campaign in a historic landslide, securing over 80% of the vote. He was no longer just a district attorney. He was a rising star in state politics, heavily favored for a future run at the governor's mansion. Evelyn Reed, the chief of staff who Dempsey had once intimidated in the rain, was now the deputy district attorney, leading a task force dedicated to cold case civil rights violations. The DA's office was a well-oiled machine of justice, blind to wealth and deaf to the old boy network, inside the walls of the Federal Correctional Institution. Time had not been kind to Owen Dempsey. 5 years in solitary confinement had stripped away his physical bulk and his sanity. His hair had thinned and turned entirely gray. His posture, once broad and intimidating, was permanently stooped. The terrifying reality of his 12-year sentence was an inescapable weight pressing down on his chest every waking second. Dempsey had spent the first 3 years fighting. He had filed endless appeals, claiming entrapment, claiming selective prosecution, and arguing that his sentence was disproportionately harsh. Every single appeal was swiftly and mercilessly denied by the appellate courts. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. The public corruption too severe. Desperation is a powerful force. It strips a man of his pride layer by agonizing layer until only a naked, trembling need remains. Having exhausted all legal avenues, Dempsey did the unthinkable. He requested a pen and a single sheet of paper from the prison guard. Sitting on the edge of his steel bed, his hands shaking, he wrote a letter to the one man who possessed the power to recommend a sentence commutation to the Department of Justice. He wrote to District Attorney Robert Calloway. The letter was a masterpiece of pathetic manipulation. Dempsey didn't truly apologize for the lives he had ruined. He apologized that things had gotten out of hand. He wrote about the mental toll of solitary confinement. He begged Calloway, as a man of God and the law, to show mercy. He asked Calloway to submit a letter of support to the federal parole board to shave a few years off his sentence, promising he would move away, change his name, and never return to Oakage. A week later, Evelyn Reed walked into Calloway's spacious corner office and dropped a plain white envelope stamped with the federal prison insignia onto his desk. "You're going to want to read this," Evelyn said, an unreadable expression on her face. "It's from FCI Shill, inmate Dempsey." Calloway picked up the envelope. He used a silver letter opener to slice it open and unfolded the single sheet of ruled paper. The handwriting was cramped, erratic, a stark contrast to the bold, aggressive citations Dempsey used to write on fabricated parking tickets. Calloway read the letter in total silence. His expression never changed. He didn't smile in triumph, nor did he frown in pity. He read the words of a broken man, begging for the very mercy he had aggressively denied to hundreds of innocent citizens for years. "What does he want?" Evelyn asked. "He wants a recommendation for a sentence reduction." Calloway replied softly. "He says he's learned his lesson. He says the cage is breaking his mind. Are you going to respond?" Calloway leaned back in his leather chair and looked out the window. Down below, the city of Oakage moved in a steady, peaceful rhythm. He thought about the heat map Lucy Jenkins had generated 5 years ago, the sea of red dots clustered over the poorest neighborhoods. He thought about the single mothers forced to choose between feeding their children and paying an extortion fee to get their cars back. He thought about the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of a man who believed the law was merely a tool for his own enrichment. Mercy is a virtue, but justice is a requirement. Calloway opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a thick file labeled United States versus Dempsey Archival. He flipped through the meticulously organized pages until he found what he was looking for. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a legal brief or an FBI wiretap transcript. It was a photocopy of a crude, grease-stained receipt from Higgins Towing, the same receipt Calloway had demanded on that sweltering July evening 5 years prior. The receipt for $425, cash only. Calloway took a thick black marker and wrote 3 words across the top of the receipt. Denied. Serve your time. He didn't write a letter. He didn't explain his reasoning. He simply folded the photocopy, slid it into a fresh envelope, addressed it back to inmate 88492-054, and handed it to Evelyn. "Mail this," Calloway instructed, and then closed the file. "We are done with Owen Dempsey forever." When the envelope arrived at the federal prison, Dempsey tore it open with frantic, trembling fingers praying for a lifeline. When he pulled out the photocopy of the tow receipt and read the black ink across the top, the last remaining shred of his hope evaporated. The paper slipped from his hands and fluttered to the cold concrete floor. Dempsey sat on his steel bunk, buried his face in his hands, and finally wept. He had towed a car to teach a man a lesson. Instead, he had dismantled his own life piece by piece, until nothing remained but the four walls of a cage. That evening, as the sun dipped below the oakage skyline, casting long golden shadows across the streets, Robert Calloway left the courthouse. He walked with the confident, steady stride of a man who had kept his promises to his city. He turned the corner and walked into the municipal parking lot. The faded yellow lines of the old fire lane had long since been removed, repainted into perfectly measured, pristine parking stalls. Calloway walked up to his car, the same midnight blue Audi A6. He unlocked it, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The dashboard lit up a soft, high-tech glow in the fading light. As he pulled out of the lot and merged onto Elm Street, nobody watched him from the shadows. No corrupt officer ran his plates. No tow trucks waited around the block. There was only the quiet hum of the engine and the profound, undeniable presence of justice in a city that had finally learned how to fight back. Power without accountability is a dangerous weapon. But as Officer Owen Dempsey learned the hard way, arrogance is the ultimate trap. He thought his badge made him a king, giving him the right to extort, humiliate, and steal from the vulnerable. But he messed with the wrong district attorney. Robert Calloway didn't fight back with yelling or violence. He fought back with the devastating, crushing weight of the law, permanently changing a city and ending a corrupt empire. The hunter became the hunted, and a petty parking dispute ended in a 12-year federal prison sentence. True justice doesn't boast, it executes. What did you think of District Attorney Calloway's brilliant, silent revenge? Did Officer Dempsey get exactly what he deserved, or was the punishment too harsh? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of karma and justice, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true life stories where the bad guys finally get what's coming to